This is week 10, and we talk about the courts. First question is, how do the courts differ from the political branches? And I've listed a number of things here to identify how the courts are different. For one thing, they're ignored by the public. That is to say, they really don't pay any attention to what the court's doing on any kind of day-to-day basis. Whether we're talking about courts at the district level or at the Supreme Court level. And they really just don't pay any attention to what is happening or who the members of the court are or anything like that. And so if you were to go to people on the street and show them pictures of members of the, say, Supreme Court of the state of Illinois, chances are they wouldn't have the foggiest idea who these people are. Another thing is that the courts are considered less political than the other branches of government. I even identify the executive and legislative branches as political branches, whereas the Supreme Court is. It's not that they're not considered political, especially at the state level, because these people get elected, and we know that the courts are not objective as they're supposed to be. So, rich people getting a better shake than poor people and able to afford better lawyers and therefore getting off and all that kind of thing. But they are considered to be less political. You wouldn't walk into a court and say to the judge before the case begins, before you hear my case, I'd like to donate to your next campaign. That wouldn't be appropriate. But you could say that to the political branch people anytime. So anyway, it is considered to be less political. They campaign differently for the courts. Oftentimes, in probably a majority of the cases, it's nonpartisan. And nonpartisan elections, you may or may not know, are those in which no parties appear on the ballot, only the candidates' names. There's a difference in public expectations as well. The public expects the courts that behave differently. We're not surprised when we hear that a governor showed political favoritism when awarding a contract or something like that. But if a judge were to do that, say, have somebody come into his court and he openly or she openly treated the person differently because they were of a political party affiliation they didn't like, that wouldn't go over very well. So our public expectations is that they will be objective. Whether in fact they really are or not is another question. Another thing, of course, is that to be on the courts, even at the lowest level, you have to have some kind of qualifications to run for office. You have to at least be a lawyer, have gone to law school, have passed the bar exam, and in most cases have at least tried some kind of cases. The opportunity I saw the other day when one of President Trump's appointees was appearing before a congressional committee that reviews those appointments in the Senate. He was really ignorant of any of the procedural practices that go on in court, and he had never practiced law or anything, and I'm sure it was very embarrassing for him. So he didn't fit the qualifications, and the next day after that, he withdrew his name. Anyway, we expect that people who run for office, especially who run for judges, are going to be qualified to hold these positions, even at the state and local level, even at the lowest levels. And then the last thing is they're rated by their peers. You have bar associations that rate the candidates when they run for judgeships. And you don't have anything like that. There's no qualifications to run for office. And sometimes I think it's too bad that we don't have qualifications, especially in this day and age when anybody, no matter what their background is, can run for office. Even the highest offices, you don't have to have any background in government whatsoever. And that turns out to be pretty disastrous. But anyway, you don't need qualifications, and you're not really judged by your peers before you run. Um, but in terms of courts, you are, because you've got these bar associations and they rate all the candidates. Second question is, what's the effects of too many lawyers in our society? Well, there's a whole bunch of things. I just listed a few of my pet peeves about lawyers in our society. One is that you see legalese in almost every paperwork kind of thing you come across, like whether it's a contract, a business deal, you buy something, um, whatever it is, insurance policy, wherever you go and whatever you have to sign in this world, it's usually some kind of legalese, which means that it's written in complicated language that very few people can understand. Um, and that's because there's so many lawyers, and lawyers are the ones putting these pieces of paper together. Second thing is that lawyers are in business. They're not just in private practice. Back in the day when we didn't have 2 million lawyers operating in the United States, they primarily just served as lawyers. That is to say, they were in private practice, and they waited for consumers to come to them, or they advertised for people to come to their office, and they specialized in certain kinds of law. But today, there are many, many lawyers who don't practice any kind of law, period. They just work in business, and they kind of consult the businesses about what they should do in terms of their legal position. For example, if you looked at something like McDonald's, which has its national headquarters in Chicago, they got a whole building, and most of that office building is filled with lawyers. So what do? Oh, they threaten to sue people whenever they use some kind of a clown or something that looks like the patented version of Ronald McDonald. They put forms together. They just spend a whole lot of time dealing with whatever potential legal issues might happen to a company like McDonald's. Another thing is that there's so much litigation. You would never, back in, 50 years ago or so, you would never have so much litigation. People litigate about everything in this world today. Anytime somebody's dissatisfied with something, not just people who go to a business, but dissatisfied with their neighbor or something along those lines, or dissatisfied with a product they bought, whatever it is, there's a tendency to say, I want to go to court. I remember when my son Mark was about 10 years old, I was using the typical parental approach. When it was around Christmas time, I was trying to get him to be good, and I said to him, I won't get you anything for Christmas unless you behave. I thought that was the kind of thing that usually the parents say to their kids. And he said to me, so typical of Americans, he said to me, if you don't buy me something for Christmas, I'll sue you. 10 years old. Welcome to America. Another thing is that there's a defensive practice in both business and medicine. And I'd say almost everybody in any kind of relationship with the public, any kind of business, any kind of thing that you have to do like medicine or business, there's a defensive approach. That is to say, they're always trying to protect themselves. For example, if you go into a medical facility and talk to a doctor, you have a problem, and you ask the doctor, what's wrong with me? The doctor's not going to answer you. The doctor's going to say, well, let me take some tests, and then we'll figure it out. And so that's what they do, and that may seem innocuous on the face, but the reality is, if you went back to a time when doctors weren't practicing defensive medicine, weren't afraid about being sued, thanks to all these lawyers who are doing all this malpractice suing, um, they would have responded much differently. They would have given you a prognosis based on what you looked like and how you operated in their office. For example, when I first started running, I got this problem of what's now commonly known as runner's knee. And what happens is the patella on the knee swells up. It's right, that part of your knee right in front of the knee on the lower part of it. It's that particular thing swells up, and you get real stiff when you're not running, and it oftentimes hurts when you are running. And so this was in the days before there was something called athletic medicine, and doctors who specialized in it. And so very few people knew about this. And I went around to some of the best places in Chicago, medical clinics and hospitals where supposedly the best doctors practice. And everybody to a person wanted to do some kind of exploratory surgery because they had no idea what was wrong with me. Um, so I finally went to this doctor thanks to a colleague of mine at Lewis. He said this guy has been in sports medicine forever, and he's the team doctor for the Bears. And so I went and see him. His name was Hamilton. And, I then spent about a 25-year relationship with Dr. Hamilton. And, he was an old-fashioned doctor. He'd look at me, he tested my knee, he measured my knee, all that kind of stuff, without ever talking about taking a test or an x-ray or something. And then he just told me, you got runner's knee. And he told me what to do about it, to ice it and do these exercises and so on, and I was fine. But he was an old-fashioned doctor who didn't, if you wanted to take an x-ray, if you wanted to do tests, he would be happy to do it for you. But he knew how to diagnose what the problems were. And that was all done in a time before lawyers who operate from the worst case scenario. They're always worried about the worst case scenario. And we can't live in life like that. You can't be ready to before you even talk to the people to go over to your neighbors and threaten to sue them and that kind of stuff. But that's the mentality we live in. And then the last one is public expectations of judicial solutions to everyday problems. We really think that somehow if we take our problem, even if it's minor, like if you ever watched Judge Judy or somebody like that, where it's small claims court, the people are not talking about big amounts of money or major problems. They're talking about little things that happen to them. And we're expecting the courts to figure it out for us. And to me, that's really sad and a product of the too many lawyers, because what we're experiencing is our inability to work out our problems for ourselves. Number 3, how do state courts differ from the national courts in structure and function? Well, on the left here, I have the structure, and on the right, I have the functions. In terms of structure, there's an extra layer at which are the lower courts at the state and local level. So what you find is you have what we call minor courts at the bottom, below the district courts. Now, one of the problems you have at state and local politics and state and local courts is that their names are all different. But essentially, if you look at the national system, you have district courts at the bottom, appeals courts in the middle, and the Supreme Court at the top. So there's 3 levels. Basically, you have the same thing at the state level. You have a district level, there's a lot of different names for it, and then appeals courts, and then the Supreme Court. Even the Supreme Court has different names from state to state. But anyway, you have, let's just leave it at the same terminology. You have district court, appeals court, Supreme Court. At the state level, you have an extra layer. It's called lower courts. And those lower courts deal with minor offenses. That would be things like traffic. That's a common, biggest, major court at the low level would be traffic court. And, everybody who gets a ticket who wants to challenge it goes to court. They either go to court by themselves or they have a lawyer. And so that kind of thing. Minor criminal and civil cases as well are in this lower level at the state level. So you have like criminal cases would be misdemeanors. Some kid throws a brick through a window or damages somebody's car or by keying it or something like that. So it's relatively minor kinds of things. Steal something, that's probably the classic example is stealing something from a store. So they're minor things, like when we were kids, we probably stole candy or something. So that you'd get that kind of thing at the lower level. And then civil cases, they define it as, cases like you see in like a television shows like Judge Judy, where it's small, what we generally refer to as small claims court. That is, you have a civil case, like for example, a lot of the cases are an individual up against a business where it's a minor offense, like you took your sweater to the cleaners and they didn't take the stain out, or they ruined it, or you lost a button or something like that. And people actually go to court over this nonsense. Anyway, that's all handled at the lowest level. And if you look at the national structure, they don't have that. They don't have that low level. Everything starts at district court. And then the functions, you hear at the state level, you hear civil and criminal cases, and they go all the way from minor things like traffic to murder or divorce in civil cases. So keep in mind there's a civil side which deals with relationships between people and rewards money, doesn't send anybody to jail. And then there's the criminal side where you violate the criminal code and therefore you have to either get a heavy fine or some kind of fine, and then maybe even jail time or community service or something along those lines. So at the state level, these civil and criminal cases vary from the lowest kinds of things like traffic to the highest things like murder and family court and divorce court and all that stuff. So that's the state level. On the national courts, the U.S. is where they're involved with the following kinds of cases at the national level, and that would be where the U.S. is a party to the case, the U.S. Constitution is involved, it's a constitutional issue, citizens of different states are suing each other, and something like bankruptcy or interstate commerce. All of those kinds of cases are national court cases. Then you'd go to federal court for any kind of case like those on the bottom. Everything else, pretty much, all the day-to-day kind of things that might come up belong to state court. So the state court is, in some ways, is way more important, at least to the average citizen, than is the national courts. Then the last one is, how are judges selected? And there's three basic ways in which judges are selected. The first is election, and that can be by partisan election or nonpartisan election. Again, the difference being parties appear on a ballot, or just the names of the candidates appear on a ballot. Second method is appointment, and that appointment could be by the governor, could be by the legislature, or it could be by a judge. Usually when it's a judge appointing another judge, it's usually a higher court judges appointing lower court judges at the state level. And then the last one is a combination of election and appointment, and that's the Missouri plan, where there's a method in which, first of all, there's a commission of citizens appointed by the governor, and that commission then picks three candidates, and then the governor picks one of those candidates to be the judge, and then that judge serves for a period of time, usually it's a year or so, and then the public gets to vote whether that person is retained in office or not. So it's a combination of election and appointment. You can see all of these methods described in the book.